first ever a cup. Great to see you here today. I want to just quickly, because this is not a given for some people, surprisingly, here at COP. Carbon removals is the activity of removing CO2, which is all in the atmosphere, as opposed to stopping new CO2 or new emissions from going into the atmosphere. So the latter is emissions reductions, but cleaning the air that's already dirty with CO2 is carbon removals. And that's something that we do in a vast number of ways. Those of you who are here in the room and not online can look behind and you see a whole suite of different methods explained in great depth, maybe not such great depth, on the back wall. And of course we're here, the Carbon Removals community is here to help you all week. CDR 30 is the name of our initiative. It is a community initiative that the Negative Emissions Platform, which I run, has been helping, has been supporting to get off the ground. Coalition, universities, think tanks, NGOs, and the CDR industry itself together to bring you this pavilion at COP30. So without further ado, I'm going to have a session. Okay, I'm going to hand over with a different microphone to Ashish Kumar from Mati Carbon. Ashish, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. How's the energy level on the third day? It's only the third day. So, yeah, thank you all for joining. And, yeah, it's a great pleasure. Our esteemed co-panelists with me. We have one still missing, hopefully on the way. So, I'd like to invite Gareth Phillips, African Development Bank. And Marina Ragwa from the Nature Conservancy. And yeah, both we have very bilateral agencies coming here. So, as Chris explained, one of the core objectives of this session is to really connect what you heard about carbon removal, which is a niche, emerging sector. The broader climate finance thematic, like international development, as what we talk about in nature finance or adaptation and resilience. Some of those connections are not that well established. So in this session, we're gonna cover how we make those linkages and hear from experiences of whatever Gareth and Marina have doing in this related area. So I think broadly we want to cover the theme of agri-value chain, agri-food systems as a sector. And within that, many of you know that more than a third of our food production globally comes from small farmers, smallholder farmers, defined as less than hectare in holding. And although they have a huge contribution to the system, less than 2% of the broader global climate finance goes to followers, and more than 80% of them have high likelihood of facing some climate threat in the next couple of decades. So there's been a huge amount of work going on in sort of smallholder agri-financing over the last few decades, and our co-panelists is going to cover some of those themes as well. We're going to touch upon different initiatives having in smallholder finance. But what is the forward-looking view as well, the initiatives that we are all working on, and how does that link? So with that framing, I'd love to introduce, I'd love to have Gareth talk a little bit about himself, what that AFDB is doing in this area. And then after that, right?
Okay, we've got it. Great. Well, thank you very much, Ashish, for inviting me. My name is Gareth Phillips. I manage climate and environmental finance in the Development Bank. Well, actually, I think this is a very interesting topic. Just to address some of the points it saddens me to hear that carbon removal is considered a niche sector. Because, look, I'm sure you know better than I do, in the Paris Agreement it says that parties will balance emissions by removals with sinks by 2050. And there were, actually, after the Markets Initiative, I have to say I was never a great fan of it, but they set out, I think it's minimized now, but they set out a huge target to focus on building capacity for emission reductions. And I them at the time, look, that's great, but that's not the goal. You know, it's now. But it kind of fell on deaf ears, and the technology is different and so on. And I think that it's really interesting it's great to see you here now hosting a pavilion to raise issues around this. It's great to see technologies going there in the background. And I think to start the role of carbon markets in financing these activities, because, and this is my big surprise for you, I don't think it's the right mechanism. Financing these things through carbon markets and market-based approaches, I think, is not the way to go. And I think, based on the experience that we're developing the adaptation benefits mechanism, no market approaches are much fairer and more transparent than this. I think when you come to I'll talk a bit more about the adaptation benefit mechanism. But let me just say a couple of words about Article 6 and what's special about it. Article 6, when it builds from the Kyoto Protocol, and of course the flexibility mechanisms on there, what Article 6 allows you to generate different kinds of assets that you can sell to make projects bankable or investable. It means that you can provide enough projects to live so they can and borrow money. So Article 6 allows the creation of those assets that you can sell, but 99% of the focus has been on creating ITMOs, mitigation outcomes, reductions and so on. And that's because it's a profit-making activity into this. And I'm not against making a profit, that is not a use of the scarce fund. Non-market just to be completely open. But I'll pause now, and in my next question I'll say a bit more about what
Marina, would you love to hear about the great work that the Nature Conservancy has been doing in this space and your own sort of background and work in that?
Thank you so much. And I share the amusement of Gareth of looking at this pavilion, something neat on the comp. And in addition to that, I also share some of the views that Gareth mentioned, in particular to non-marketable approaches to adaptation finance. I was just yesterday on a session talking about financing for nature, and the focus was on non-marketable approaches, because we need to be thinking about the development of non-marketable approaches, about the fact that we might not be generating direct I'll pause there, but it's speak about my name is Marina. I'm Portuguese, I wrote back in English.
Sorry, I misspelled it.
That's fine. I'm used to it. I'm an economist by training. I worked in private markets, early on private equity to sustainable development. And at TNC, I'm leading the effort of development of economics and finance for the Brazilian Amazon in particular. But we do a lot of stuff at TNC globally as well. And one of the things that I can share is that on the spectrum of approaches towards carbon removal, we're definitely on the very beginning of it. So we are on the peatland wetland restoration, we are on nature deforestation, reforestation, and nature-based solutions, nature climate first street carbon removal. And what do we see and how is that? Basically because connected to adaptation. They make communities more resilient. And I can give some examples of the work that we're conducting on the ground that are tied and comproved actually in SAP and in the Brazilian Amazon. We're working with communities for the support of agroforestry systems. We supported over 2,000 farmers here in Pará in particular. And through that work, we definitely proved the costs and the caps that you have is way of the carbon removal that you actually generate. And there's no market premium that's gonna reward you for that. So that's why I shared the vision that that's not the end goal. The end goal of transition is actually to make those communities more resilient and sustainable over time. And we have other means to do so, particularly loans and lending. In Indonesia, where we're working with lands conservation, and that is particularly tied to the reducing of flooding risks in communities and mangroves restoration in New Guinea, which is also a project that, through the restoration of mangroves, we are also supporting with the income of those communities and their livelihood. All of it to say that adaptation globally, and certainly in Brazil, is definitely underfunded. We have less than 10% of climate finance that actually goes and flies through quoted adaptation mechanisms. But we see some key challenges arising from this. And one of them is the lack of the exit route, the lack of the mechanisms that will be able to be lending to those farmers and it's supporting that transition to be making profitable way cash flow.
There, and I think the range of the impact, adaptation results impact in all of them. Not like either or. So being able to really, both quantify one side and create that legal of being able to have the same language for different types of stakeholders, from investors, public sector is important. I think with the context intro, it'll be useful to dive deeper into some of the initiatives that both have been championing. And as you were alluding to, there's both market and non-market mechanisms. So I'd love to hear about the ABM mechanism in a bit more detail, especially for the audience here who haven't probably been aware of that. Deeper work in adaptation resilience, and some of that is linked to ANR.
Thanks very much indeed for that introduction. So let me talk a little bit about market and non-market approaches. In the market approaches, I know this because I worked in the clean development mechanism. First of all, I worked as a validator, a verifier, DOE, doing this project, and moved to a private sector investment bank. And our role, our job, our goal in that was to be the Saudi Arabia of the carbon world. We wanted to produce the carbon at $2 a ton and sell it at $30 a ton to maximize the profit. That's what we tried to do. And that, at the time, that was the way the CDS structured. And the reason why you're able to do that on market approaches is that you're producing a homogeneous commodity, which means that it can be you can establish a benchmark price. When you have a benchmark price is governed by supply, and if you produce it from a benchmark price, then you can make a profit. And that's why, fundamentally, that's why the clean development mechanism ended up with such an uneven playing field. And all the money went to China, Brazil, India, and it didn't come to Africa because it was just too difficult. You couldn't make as much, so little to pay. So look, there's nothing wrong with with making a profit and doing that kind of stuff, but in the end, it didn't do what we wanted to do. And Brazil, well, not Brazil, Bolivia was always complained about not commoditizing Mother Nature and so on. And that really led to the inclusion of this concept of market agreement. Now, which I think probably suffers from the same as the name carbon. It's not a very sexy name, you know, invested in non-markets. But actually, they really are very exciting because what we've discovered through the development of this adaptation benefits mechanism is that we can set the price for our adaptation benefits depending on cost of the project. So what we do in the market approach is take the capital cost of the project plus the financing cost, so that's the income borrowing money, plus the transaction costs, that's the cost of the might have. Okay, but you don't get many revenue adaptation projects. There are some, but not often a lot. And that leaves you with a financial barrier. You don't have enough money to pay off the money that you need, and so you're stuck. So to pay off that money, then you can't go to the capital markets. You can't borrow money to pay the project. So you take that financial gap or the financial barrier, and you divide it by the benefits that you're going to generate. And that gives you the price of the adaptation benefit. And then we allow the project developer to create that number of adaptation benefits to be sold at that price to overcome their financial barrier. Now, it's interesting because it's been killing. They wouldn't have wanted to invest in that, they wanted an alpha return. But that's very fair use of climate finance. You can make a living from it because you can have a job. You know, your job is part of the capital costs of the project. So you can pay yourself a salary and those kinds of things, but you're not going to make a big return and be able to retire. So that, of course, explains why, you know, the carbon markets are invested in the non-market approaches because it's driven by, by being, you know, and think they can make money from it. Now, I'm talking about adaptation because we've applied it in the context of adaptation, but I think you can take that very same approach and just replace adaptation with carbon removal.
Yes.
And so what the pitch I would say is that instead of trying to finance your project by saying, oh, I'm going to generate $300 because it's carbon removal, not carbon, I think it would be not as profitable. Exciting maybe, but it's much less risky to say this is the money that I need to make my project viable, this is the return I want to make on my capital investment, you know, I can't make some money back on that. Therefore, this is the price of the carbon removal that I need to get to make my project viable.
Right, yeah.
Now, if we can create a construct like that, then we in the adaptation benefits mechanism, we have an adaptation for markets where we place our projects, advertise them to buyers. The buyers will come and purchase the adaptation benefits. Some will be on the shelf from what we call exposed projects. We'll be retrofitting the ABM, and some will be ex ante, where you sign a purchase agreement which acts as collateral to borrow the money. So it's a bit technical. I have a brochure, by the way, which explains this. I'll leave some there before I go, because I have to leave before the end. But I do have a brochure kind of explains everything. So if you can borrow the money, then you can pay it back. At the African Development Bank, of course, we would like to lend you that money. We can set up a fund. There's lots of donors who are happy to give money for lending.
Right.
Canada, for example, is very keen to lend money, but they want to exceptional loans. So we can set up a fund, lend to carbon project who have a registered project, a signed purchase agreement that's going to give them cash flow. We can certainly lend to an entity like that, right? and then repay that loan from the sale of the offsets. And that would allow the upside, any money that you make from that, to stay with the project developer. Because in the carbon markets, project developers ended up selling their emission reductions to the financier for like $5 or $10 a ton.
Yeah.
And they never made any money from it. And that's why they never came back to repeat the project, because, you know, the dream didn't work out.
I think you cover a few different exciting elements linking to what we are trying to do in carbon removal and how that finance gap could be filled through audience. So Per, we've been talking a little bit about the context of work that African Development Bank and the Nation Conservancy has been doing in the context of agri and smallholder value chain. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and talk a little bit on the broader set of work Nora has been doing, and then we can go into questions.
Sorry for being late. I was stuck in that ministerial meeting in Norwegian and the Ethiopian planning. I would encourage you all, if you want to see the upsides of long government operation in this thing, to dive a little bit into what Ethiopia has delivered, and of course the land use space since they launched their Yeah, sorry. Take a look at Norway, Ethiopia. Was a great that strong, exceptional results on land use and forestry in particular. That's why I was late. So I think I'll focus on what we do on agricultural relevant work in the interest between food security, adaptation, and just plain productivity private sector involvement. Two particular examples that we've spent some time developing and are now coming off stream. First, the FASA fund for agricultural development in sub-Saharan Africa. This is essentially a first facility investments in small medium enterprises in that fund was set up based on that particular sector is absolutely crucial in sub-Saharan Africa. And that sector is completely funded because the risk profile is it's relatively high, which understood. So what we did was setting up this FASA fund, which first was the only by the French investment IFAD. They will put that first loss capital, which is completely concessional grant announced from USAID, paid out before that happened, from Norway and also from UK and Korea, among others. First loss capital is then invested in local investment funds that in turn invest in small and medium enterprises. The reason why it's structured like that is the point I made earlier about they're hard to understand and quite high risk profile. Specialized, sectoral, regionally based investment funds are those best positioned to know what that risks are and take it on the most reasonable possible terms. So this will drive investment in small and medium enterprises, who are the first point of contact for farmers in access to the market, but also access to inputs. So this is by now about an $80 million fund. It has a $100 million capitalization target. These are hard times, but we are going to continue to work with FASA because we strongly believe in it. The pipeline is already looking very interesting after only a year. Another, just to touch quickly on, is our support to ASELI. So we have a very interesting model for incentivizing banks to invest in agriculture. Again, it's the same risk profile issue. They structure their incentives in various ways to drive this, including lower cost of and also targeted premiums for particularly high-risk investments. Another very interesting element in the ASELI work is that they are big enough to build a knowledge portfolio of all these loans and their performance over time. And a quantified overview of that is perhaps the most important missing ingredient in making this commercial. So that's a really interesting space when they're making that data available. So that is something we foresee to
help drive down the cost of capital throughout the sector beyond the loans they're actually making.
Yeah, thank you, Per. I think you highlighted a number of forward-looking initiatives that have come out in agri-SME financing, smallholder financing over the last many years. I think that segues well into the theme around how the right finance for type of agri-SMEs and nature projects. And Maria, I understand, the Tension University has been working a lot in terms of applying different blended finance mechanisms, as you also alluded to earlier. So why don't you elaborate a little bit on like some of the specific, facilities or projects that you guys have done, and also a bit forward-looking in the future, what are the ideal structures and design you will see more in the market? Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. And what I could say, and equally the risk-return profile, particularly when we look at from greenfield projects that are on the ground and prospecting with smallholders opportunities for finance, what we're seeing is that many different, some of them to back up the proper efficiency to even quantify what is the potential return, for instance, for a large agroforestry system that you have over 40 species that are being by the same field. The other big challenge that we see is structured supply chain to actually deliver on these needs. The procurement had to invest on that particular agroforestry system. So those two combined, they increase not only the risk profile, but they also increase the feasibility of that project of its own. So when we look at the potential for revenue generation and trying to embed that into financial operations, then we have even a greater challenge. Because when we're talking to a small, so it comes back to your name about how we approach and conduct non-marketable initiatives that are able to recognize and that value, understand. They won't be making the additional profit ever at no particular project. And in addition to that, what we're seeing, particularly on accessible credit, is the difficulty barriers to entry, particularly speaking to smallholders. So one of the big initiatives that we have that was launched at COP26, combined with IFAD, and under this initiative, we have already seen and supported over 500 million of capital blended finance to be deployed under these three particular landscapes.
Right.
And what arises from that is that we have a room to go for increased productivity. It's easier to deploy capital, it's easier to make the case, it's the perceived risk and the risk-return balance is feasible. But we have a lot of room to go, particularly when we're talking about restoration, reforestation, and capturing carbon under an ARR project.
Yeah. So an organic and inorganic are different types of carbon.
Yes. What right experience is that great. We have 26 signatories now. Some of the largest in South America and Brazil are part of this initiative. But they have a very challenging time trying to get the right capital stack to deploy the loans that they are willing to give.
Right.
And that has to do with the invaluable financial structure that the project is financing. They are directly financing. Are challenging to stand alone. So right from that is basically to have more capital that is flexible, that is understandable in terms that those loans actually need.
Yeah.
And in the future, if we can get that far in terms of the monetary part and verification, and what we are the premium, the carbon component as a to support farmers under that transition. So we have this initiative. It was launched at COP CCAT concessional capital for Amazon, Cerrado. And the initiative is actually to support this need for concessional capital in this broader IFAD umbrella.
Right.
And we're doing that with the support of Vox Capital, which is a manager, a general partner here in Brazil. And the idea is to bridge that need, having concessional to do risk operations so that we can actually have lending coming out from commercial banks and direct capital markets, be it to SMEs, be it to operations such as the receivables operation that we have for the certificate for schools and agribusiness.
That's very useful. The need, how it's been sort of innovatively developed, the examples that you gave there on FASA and sell side and you the definition is very dominant. I think let me draw this whole discussion closer to the role that carbon markets play in things like ABM that you hinted earlier, Gareth, and how different sets of initiatives each of you are involved in, be it sort of different voluntary market or compliance market side. So maybe I'll see if you have any thoughts linking credits that are out there, then afterwards.
Thank you very much. So, one of the features of the non-market approach is that you don't create any assets for transfer. So, and that might be a barrier for what you're trying to do here, because that you're not allowed to create carbon credits that can be transferred out of the country to a buyer. What we do in the ABM is we recognize adaptation benefits, which contribute to the livelihoods, the resilience, the security of households and communities, and recognize voluntary contribution towards the cost of that project. So it's money that, for example, entities capture, money that they might spend on contributing towards resilient needs. And coming in to make these projects viable, to sequester carbon that would contribute to the host country's ambition. It's not to create emissions for transfer. However, if you do enable the host country to sequester, then you will strengthen their contribution toward their nationally determined contribution, you will raise their ambition, and you might free up headroom at the top of their inventory to trade away units. So it could then stimulate trade, but not necessarily the entities that these projects. If you put that into the case of farmers, that is quite an interest. Okay, the direct air capture and underground interesting. Finance, this kind of approach could be really meaningful, and they really not care about whether or not they're increasing the carbon that's stored in the soil. Crop product is going. So those are important to them, and I think that this from an adaptation view, or that you don't have to go to the complexity of storing the carbon. You know it's going there. You can do some macro and say estimating we're storing $10, 10 pounds per hectare, but we're not going over this scientific trying to quantify it, because what we saw people are buying those credits and using them for compliance in international regimes. So if I buy a ton and I tell my government, my legislative framework, I'm targeting this ton, and then that ton doesn't exist, or somebody questions that, then so that makes, and that's why again the CDM can use some companies with all the experts, all the measurements and so on. And, well, frankly, it's a waste of money in many cases. so much more by just channeling the money into the adaptation actions and saying, this is making these people more, that's worth paying for, and there's a carbon storage, carbon removal code with it that we're going to estimate that will improve the host country. And I think that, that's, in the context of getting money to micro, small, and medium enterprise farmers, I think very interesting. One more point on the diversification of risk. When you go for a results-based program like that, you push risk down to farmers. They're the ones who take the risk. They're the ones that you democratize the funding. Instead of concentrating it in the GCF and the adaptation fund, where only a few definitely not these kind of small-scale farmers. Push it down smaller businesses who can take out loans. And this is quite interesting. It's an interesting debate on the commercial loan. In the context of the ABM, it doesn't really matter. We internalize the financial costs into the price that the buyer ultimately pays. So if you borrow professional money 2.5%, or commercial money at 15%, okay, it all price for the buyer to farmers' ability to act. And you could argue, why should an investor be able to benefit from concessional finance? Why should the ministry do commercial lending? And that then the bearing on the kind of finance that we're able to provide.
Yeah, no, this is the renewable technology that are most relevant. Anything from HR, enhancer offering to afforestation in the smallholders, which can plug the some of that we're talking about in terms of as well as filling the gap of ABM funding that you mentioned. To hear from your side, your perspective on different carbon market mechanisms you have either tried on or sort of is looking at compliance as well as different avoidance and removal perspective.
Yeah, thank you. So first, NORAD, of course, is an agency of the carbon markets. Act more work on the I used to run the Norwegian Climate and Forest Initiative from the Ministry of Environment and Climate, for example, and they have most of that work. But I'll just talk from a Norwegian perspective. It's a complicated space. So I think that is absolutely crucial is to understand the sector what you're trying to do. Because the carbon markets to be effective needs to give those decisions that control the outcomes. And if you go to reducing tropical forest loss, that's governments. It's not project developers, it's governments. Brazil, Indonesia, Gabon, Ethiopia, Costa Rica, amazing turnaround stories, all policy driven. For obvious reasons, it's not land use, really understood. It's a regulatory, it's a subsidy, it's a tax issue. That means if you want carbon markets to work there, you have to target the governments with incentives. So we had a quite misguided interregnum of project-based approaches to REDD+. We tried to argue that those were unlikely to, and I think time has given us some credit for that position. At some point, when we advance, obviously we also need to do the work on the ground in local circumstances. But that needs to be nested in the government because it's all about. When you are heading for a space like getting small farmers to increase the carbon content of their soils, then you need to incentivize the farmers, right? That's a farm plot by farm plot size. That is basically which is what project approaches tropical forests. Completely different. I controversial. The problem is the structure. There. The third point what can drive this kind of overall true to what extent it should. But when you move to where what you're actually producing doesn't have an intrinsic financial value, you're market to create that value, it becomes extremely risky because the incentive for the